The first time I heard them, the world seemed to tilt on its axis, an imperceptible shift beneath a bruised twilight sky. We had settled into the battered trench 5 days past, our uniforms stiff with sweat and the blood of comrades still soaking into the clay walls. Above us, the dying light bled red across the clouds, as if the heavens themselves mourned. Oil lamps guttered in the half-light, their flickering flames casting quivering shadows over rain-soaked sandbags. Every so often, a jack-booted footfall echoed along the narrow gallery, punctuating the hush like a distant heartbeat. I remember the smell first, a brittle tang of cordite and damp earth, mingled with something sweeter, ashes of things burned too long. The air felt heavy, condensed beyond all reason, as though the trench had become a living vessel, breathing in the horror of war and exhaling despair. My fingers were still raw from stowing equipment. The rough wool of my gloves chafed to bleeding seams. That's when I heard it, a low murmur as though the trench itself had spoken. At first, I thought it was Sergeant Daniels, checking in with his platoon, but the voice was too soft, too distant, carried on a wind that refused to be felt. It came in whispers, half-formed phrases that rose from the mud, pleading, mournful, urgent. "Remember us, hear us." 3 syllables repeated like a prayer. I froze, breath caught in my throat, the world narrowing to a pinpoint of dread. Around me, the others paused. Private Andrews' rifle clanged against a steel support. Corporal Hayes inhaled sharply, the rasp audible even through my own ragged breathing. The only other sound was the slow drip of water from an overhead beam. Plip, 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 each drop a metronome to the silence. We looked at one another, eyes wide, haunted, searching for rationality in the irrational. No wind stirred, no distant shell rattled the trench, yet the voices persisted, folding themselves into the darkness, insistent as a condemned man's final confession. I forced my gaze downward, willing my heart to slow, to find a path back to reason. There must be another gang of men, some other unit cutting through our line, perhaps a trapped soldier, delirious with fever, calling out for help beyond the edge of consciousness. Anything, any logical explanation, felt like salvation. My hand reached for my helmet, fingers brushing the cool steel, and I tasted grit on my tongue. Then I heard it again, closer this time. "Jameson." The whisper carried my name, each syllable a blade of ice slicing through my skull. My pulse thundered. I looked up, half expecting to see a phantom at the lip of the trench, weapon raised with intent to kill, but there was nothing. Only the damp brickwork and the glint of mud-slicked rifles lined against the wall. I swallowed and spoke, voice rough and uncertain. "Who's there?" The words seemed to shatter the spell. The voices died as though stricken mute. Silence reclaimed dominion, pressing against my eardrums until they ached. Moments passed like hours, every breath an intrusion. My unit, once brimming with the stiff pride of battle-hardened soldiers, now huddled in a graveyard hush somewhere deeper in the trench. A rat scurried, its tiny claws scrabbling on wood. It was the only sign that life persisted in this forsaken place. I closed my eyes and tried to steady myself. Memories flickered at the edges of my mind, the green fields of home, my mother's laughter drifting through an open window, the soft brush of a lover's hand on my cheek. Guilt welled up, a tide of regret for the men I'd led into this mud-slick purgatory, but when I opened my eyes, the world had not shifted back. The darkness felt alive, expectant, as if it waited for my next breath. I rose to my feet, boots sinking into waterlogged clay, and moved toward the end of the dugout where the voices had seemed to gather. The others followed, hesitantly, as if bound by an unseen chain. Each step was weighed down by uncertainty, by the fear that the trench might open beneath us and swallow us whole. As I reached the far corner, I felt the temperature drop, a chill that seeped into my bones. My breath came in ragged puffs, small clouds that dissipated too quickly. I could almost see the shapes flickering just beyond perception, outlines of men in greatcoats, rifles at rest, eyes hollow with stories left untold. The moment stretched thin, a taut wire ready to snap, and then silence, complete, oppressive silence that pressed so close I could feel my eardrums tremble. I lifted my head and whispered into the darkness, "I hear you." No answer, only the echo of my own words bouncing back at me, but in that admission, something shifted. I felt a subtle breeze, barely a whisper, as if the trench itself exhaled. My comrades stared at me, as if seeing me for the first time since arriving on this forsaken front. In that stillness, I made a silent vow. I would uncover the source of these voices, no matter the cost. I would dig through every layer of mud and memory until the truth stood before me. For how could a man sleep while echoes of the lost haunted his nights? How could he stand tall while their stories lay buried? Drowned in the stench of war, the lamps flickered one last time and steadied, casting their weak glow across trembling faces. We exchanged no words. None were needed. We shared a purpose now, etched into our souls by that half-heard chorus. The trench felt less like a prison and more like the threshold of something greater. The unquiet passed, reaching out for acknowledgement. I pressed my palm against the cold timber wall, heart hammering. Somewhere beyond the clay and wood, beyond the roar of distant artillery, lay a secret. In that moment, under a sky bruised beyond repair, I understood that the true battle was not fought with bullets alone, but with memory, with guilt, with the stubborn refusal to forget those who had given everything. And so we waited, listening, for in the hush of that trench, the dead were speaking, and they had much to say. The night wore on like a slow confession, the trench's shadows deepening into shapes that whispered in the periphery of your vision. Private Morales could feel every heartbeat, a rapid thrum in his temples that seemed to echo off the mud-caked walls. He lay on his cot, the rough canvas beneath him a poor substitute for home, and stared at the underside of the duckboard roof. Water dripped in a steady rhythm, plink, plink, and in the spaces between, he heard them again. At first, it was only a faint rustle, as if pages turned in some unseen book. Then came the sigh, a breath drawn long ago and never released, somewhere between memory and fading life. Morales propped himself up on one elbow, fingers trailing along the splintered timber until they found a knot swollen with moisture. The wood felt vulnerable there, like it might give way at the slightest pressure, much like his own nerves. He closed his eyes, trying to chase down the source of the sound, but each time darkness claimed him. A single memory wrenched him back. His brother's handwriting on thin paper, words looped in ink like lifelines thrown across distance. "I miss you, Rafa. Keep safe." How many times had he traced those letters in his mind, measuring his worth by the weight of his guilt? Battalion headquarters had taken Rafa north 6 months ago. Promoted, they said, for bravery that looked to Morales like recklessness. The last letter had come weeks before the assault. Blood smudged and half wet from rain, promising that they'd celebrate his 21st birthday together once the war was over. A soft voice called his name, and he bolted upright, jaw tight. The others in the dugout stirred, but no one spoke. "Morales." The whisper came again, shaped like a plea. His heart lurched against his ribs. He reached inside his tunic pocket and pressed fingertips against the folded letter he carried. The final gift from home, folded thrice, edges worn to translucence. The words had been written in lighter moods, before gases and grenades carved new destinies into flesh and stone. He rose, boots sliding in the mud, and shuffled toward the trench wall where the voices clustered like moths around a dying flame. Every step felt borrowed, as though he moved on credit against some hidden reckoning. The lamp's oil sputtered, sending flickers of yellow across the wet sandbags. In that wavering glow, he saw the faint outline of another handprint in the clay, no more than a whisper of impression, but enough to make his breath hitch. Morales laid his palm on the wall, tracing the arc of the print, feeling the grain give just enough under his weight. "I'm here," he murmured, voice rough as gravel. The dirt beneath his fingernails held the scent of last month's bombardment, a chemical ghost that clung to his skin, even after scrubbing. He closed his eyes and exhaled, letting the tremor in his chest slow. Memories surged forward, unbidden and vivid. He was back in their childhood kitchen, the scent of garlic and onions sizzling on a stovetop. His mother humming in the doorway. Rafa had been there too, laughing at something silly, his broad grin lighting the cramped space like a torch. He could almost hear his brother's voice, strong and steady. "We'll make it through, Rafa. We always do." But then the memory cleaved, and he remembered the letter he'd never sent. Words of fear and doubt left unsaid until it was too late. A soft sob escaped him, surprising in its suddenness. He pressed his forehead against the wood. The damp warmth, a reminder that this place was a tomb half sunken into the earth. He could feel the hollow weight of loss, a sinking stone in his gut. The trench shuddered as a distant shell found its mark, the concussion rattling his teeth. For a moment, he thought the voices might be silenced, drowned under the roar of artillery. But as the echoes faded, the whisper returned, clear as a bell. "Rafa! Rafa!" He staggered back, pulse hammering. The others watched him, their faces masks of concern and disbelief. Sergeant Drake stepped forward, rifle slung low, and placed a hand on Morales' shoulder. "Bloody hell, Private, you all right?" he asked, voice low and steady. Morales opened his mouth, but words tangled like barbed wire. He rummaged in his pocket and produced the letter, letting it drift free into Sergeant Drake's gloved hand. Drake's brow furrowed as he unfolded the paper, reading the familiar looped scrawl. The sergeant's gaze lifted to meet Morales's, and in that moment, the young soldier felt both exposed and unbearably seen. The sergeant's eyes softened, not with pity, but with understanding of the wounds that couldn't be bound by a medic's cloth. "Your brother?" Drake began, voice a whisper under the greater hush of the trench. Morales nodded, swallowing hard. "He wrote this." The letter carried the weight of a lifetime, every crease a scar of hope battered by reality. Drone of a rat scuttling somewhere deep in the earth underscored the tension, tiny claws on wood like a metronome, counting down to truth. "Yes, sir." Morales' voice cracked. "It's the last one I got. I never sent my reply." The sergeant unfolded the letter further until it lay against the wood. He ran a gloved finger over the lines. He talked about celebrating, said he'd come home. Morales closed his eyes against the ache that threatened to break him. "I promised him I'd write back, that I'd keep him safe." Silence swelled in the trench, held together only by the dim glow of the lamp. Morales felt the weight of his unspoken confession hanging between them. He could almost hear his brother's voice, half in memory, half in something darker, something that pulsed under the mud, waiting to be heard. "How long have you been hearing them?" Drake asked, exhaling slowly. Morales glanced at the lamp. Its wick steady now, as though it too was holding its breath. "Since last night, sir. Voices, echoes, they call out names. Yours, mine, sometimes just fragments." The sergeant folded the letter carefully, tucking it into his breast pocket. He studied Morales for a long moment, then squared his shoulders. "All right, come with me." He guided Morales through the trench, each step measured, boots splashing in shallow puddles. The others fell in behind, curiosity and dread flickering across their faces. They emerged into a wider dugout, where a map table sat under a battered canopy. Candles sputtered here, making the walls dance with light and shadow. Drake gestured to the far corner, where a faded chalk scroll marked names of the fallen. Dozens of them, men whose stories had been reduced to initials and dates. The trench had become their shrine, each mangled beam and bullet-scarred wall a testament to suffering. Morales traced the ragged letters with trembling fingers, names he'd never known, voices he'd never heard. Until now, he took a deep breath, feeling the damp filth on his uniform and the weight of every letter left unsent. He knelt and pressed his hand against the wall beneath the names. His own story felt small against this ledger of loss. Yet in that act lay the spark of something desperate and resolute, acknowledgement. Sergeant Drake stood behind him, silent companion in this vigil. The distant boom of artillery softened, replaced by the hush of that dugout sanctuary. Morales bowed his head, and in the beat of silence that followed, he made a promise to each name scrawled on the wood. "I hear you, I will not forget." The lamp flickered one last time, steadying in agreement as Private Morales rose. In that moment, the trench ceased to be merely a prison of earth and fear. It became a hallowed ground of echoes, where the living could listen and the dead could speak. And in the echo of his own vow, Morales felt the weight of memory shift ever so slightly toward redemption. Lieutenant Hargrove's boots pressed into the icy water of the flooded sap, each step a careful negotiation with the mud that threatened to swallow his weight. The world beyond the narrow walls felt distant, reduced to the hiss of rain sluicing down broken wooden planks and the dull thud of water-filled boots. Every breath tasted of iron and damp canvas, and the patrol's collective exhale misted in the gloom, like ghosts taking shape. In the hush, the drip of water from the roof sounded like the ticking of a clock, measuring out time they couldn't afford to waste. Hargrove paused, rifle at the ready, and signaled for the others to halt. Private Singh's eyes, wide beneath his helmet's rim, reflected the candlelight of a lone lantern set by a collapsed post. Corporal Weiss adjusted his bayonet, gloved fingers trembling ever so slightly. The lieutenant's jaw clenched. He felt the weight of command settle on his shoulders like a sodden blanket. He'd led men into worse than this, into gas-choked fields where screams were swallowed by steel. But tonight, something felt different. The sap seemed alive, as if it breathed with things better left undisturbed. A distant rumble of artillery rolled over the battered front. But here, it was a muted heartbeat, like the pulse of some ancient creature slumbering beneath the earth. Hargrove closed his eyes for a moment, recalling the clean pop of rifle shots back home, the crack of pine cones under boot, the laughter of children chasing birds in a sunlit yard. Those memories were luxuries he could no longer afford. Here, each step forward carved fresh furrows of dread into his mind. He led them deeper into the sap, water rising to mid-calves, cold enough to numb fingertips in seconds. The smell of rotting timber mingled with the tang of mold and the distant, acrid stench of cordite somewhere above. The battered duckboards creaked, and Carlin muttered a curse under his breath, an involuntary prayer for stability. Hargrove forced himself to focus on the path ahead, 300 yards to the ruined sap head, where scouts had reported movement that might signal an enemy advance, or something far less corporeal, halfway along the trench. Hargrove halted again. A shape flickered at the edge of the lantern's glow, a figure standing motionless beyond a gap in the sandbags. He raised his hand, the torch shuttering to darkness. His heart hammered so loud he feared it might betray his position. The patrol froze, rifles trained on the gap. Knuckles white against steel, the air thickened, charged with the electric tension of men staring into the void. Hargrove's breath came in shallow, rasping gulps. He remembered his father's words on the eve of his departure. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the strength to carry on in spite of it. He fiddled with the lantern's shutter, and then, in the briefest panic of indecision, let it fall back open. The smear of light carved a path through the darkness, and the figure was gone. A collective exhalation, as if the trench itself sighed with relief. But the lieutenant knew better than to let relief take root. He signaled forward motion, each step now laced with acute vigilance. The footprints of previous scouts were obliterated by mud, leaving no record of who or what had passed through. Hargrove kept his rifle trained ahead, finger resting near the trigger. Behind him the men shuffled, boots slapping in the water. Nerves raw, they reached the saphead, where a half-collapsed revetment had funneled water into a stagnant pool. Hargrove crouched, scanning the far end with the lantern. There, just beyond the reach of his light, was the silhouette once more, tall, impossibly still, shoulders squared in a soldier's posture. Face turned away. For a heartbeat, Hargrove thought he saw the glint of a helmet, the sharp line of a rifle butt, but the darkness swallowed it as swiftly as it appeared. "Identify yourself," Hargrove called, voice firm, but betraying a tremor. Silence answered, heavier than the mud beneath their boots. He stood, mouth dry, and took a step forward. The figure remained, unwavering, as though anchored to the wreckage. "Show your face," he demanded. The echo of his own words bounced back through the sodden trench, distorted and hollow. Weiss shifted beside him, bayonet raised, backing his lieutenant with silent solidarity. In that expectant pause, the rain slackened, and the only sound was the labored breathing of soldiers caught between logic and dread. Then, footsteps, high and loping, they reverberated through the sap like hollow knocks on a coffin lid. Hargrove froze, scanning every inch of the beam-scarred walls. But the sound seemed to come from within and without, everywhere at once. Private Singh let out a choked cry. His rifle slipped from his grasp and clattered wetly against the wood. Hargrove's hand shot out, grabbing Singh's arm before he could stumble. "Hold steady," he hissed, but even as he spoke, the footsteps faltered, then ceased in a single, deafening silence. The lantern flickered, and in that brief stutter of light, Hargrove saw the figure turn, just a tilt of the head, and the betraying gleam of empty eye sockets. Before darkness claimed it again, the lantern went out, plunging them into absolute black. A scream tore from Carlin's throat, short and strangled. Instinct propelled Hargrove forward, rifle raised in the dark, toward where he'd seen the face. He crashed into damp earth, mud spattering his uniform, and braced himself against the wall. The others collided behind him, man against man, a tangled mass of bodies struggling for purchase. Silence settled once more, heavy and patient. Hargrove's heartbeat thundered in his ears. He fumbled for the lantern, fingers slick with mud, and struck it against the wall to reignite the flame. Sparks sputtered, and at last pale light spilled into the trench. The lantern flickered, steadying into a weak glow that illuminated mud-streaked faces. Wide with terror, no figure remained at the far end, only the hollow timber walls, water pooling at their feet, and the debris of war, a torn gas mask, a shattered canteen, and a single mud-caked helmet, its visage fractured by shrapnel. The helmet lay askew, as if dropped in haste. Hargrove knelt, pried it free of mud, and turned it in his gloved hands. The liner was torn, straps shredded, and already brown with mold. No insignia, no name scratched inside, nothing but emptiness. He rose, helmet under arm, and faced his men. They stood in a ragged line, rifles dangling but still trained on the trench's far wall. Their eyes met his in unspoken question. What was it? What had we seen? Hargrove closed his eyes, searching for words. He thought of the patrol's purpose, to scout, to report, to survive. But tonight, the trench had offered another test, one that no map or compass could navigate. He felt the weight of that nameless helmet, a silent testament to those torn between life and death, seen and unseen. "Let's move," he finally said, voice low. "We've got what we came for." He didn't elaborate, didn't need to. In the shared understanding of fear, they found a grim solidarity. They turned and retraced their steps, boots sloshing through the black water, lantern held aloft like a fragile promise. Behind them, in the stillness of the sap, the empty helmet lay half submerged. In the faint glow of dawn yet to come, it waited for another patrol, another search, for a story to tell, a name to remember. And somewhere in the hush, the footsteps began again, soft as a sigh, bidding them heed the echoes in the dark. The dugout was quieter than usual, as though the walls themselves had paused to listen. Rain sluiced down the timber roof in muted torrents, each rivulet a steady reminder of the world outside. Chaotic, unyielding, I knelt beside a splintered beam. Tracing the jagged edge where it had cracked under bombardment, my fingers brushed against something unexpected. A flutter of paper, brittle with damp but stubbornly intact. I pried at the fragments, and a cluster of letters slid free, their envelopes frayed, ink smeared with earth. I sat back on my heels, heart racing as the lamp's glow wavered across the yellowed pages. Each envelope was sealed by a soldier's hand, the cursive names almost lost in the smudge of mud. Private Thompson, Sergeant LaRue, Corporal Baines. I lifted the topmost letter and broke its seal with a trembling thumb. Inside lay a photograph. A young man in service dress, mustached, eyes bright with confidence. On the reverse, a penciled message, "To my dearest Mary until I return." The paper crackled as I unfolded the letter itself, and I felt a surge of guilt stir in my chest. Around me, the men shifted, drawn by the soft rustle. Private Andrews peered over my shoulder, his breath hitching. Corporal Hayes stood in the corner, eyes fixed on the floorboards, as though expecting a reply to rise from the mud. I read aloud, voice low, each syllable a vow. My hands may tremble, but my heart remains steadfast. If you receive this, know that I fought for every step back home. The words echoed in the trench, mingling with the drip of water to form a lament of hope and dread. I pressed the photograph to the lamp's light, studying every line of that stranger's face. The mustache was neatly trimmed, too neat for a man who had seen weeks of battle. His collar bore the sheen of polish, and his eyes held a trace of laughter that must have been earned in quieter moments. Before the guns roared, I felt the weight of his promise, heavy as my service rifle. How many nights had he carried this letter in his breast pocket, hoping for its safe delivery? How many times had he traced the edges of that photograph, longing for the familiar curve of a lover's smile? A distant shell rattled the dugout, and we all flinched. I tucked the photograph into my tunic and reached for the next letter. This one was addressed to a mother. "Mum, I hope these words find you well. I carry your prayers into every field." The paper bore a stain the color of old wine, a blot of crimson that might have been ink or something darker. I inhaled, tasting the tang of earth and blood, the mingled scent of grief and grease that clung to every soldier here. Private Andrews cleared his throat. "Sir," he said, voice quivering, "these are from last year's assault, aren't they?" I nodded, meeting his gaze. "More than a dozen men died trying to hold this line, and these letters were never sent. They lay buried beneath us, hidden by the collapse, forgotten by time." A hush fell. The trench felt smaller then. Trench. As if we'd shrunk inside the walls by the weight of those untold stories. I lifted another letter, this one sealed with wax, and snapped it open with a decisive tug. Inside, the handwriting was cramped, hurried. "If this reaches you, I have failed my men. Tell them to carry on without me, that their lives matter more than any ground." The words burned into me. I closed my eyes, picturing that soldier's final moments. The recoil of his rifle, the stink of cordite, the flash of steel. He had written his confession beneath a sky lit by explosions. The ground, trembling as death danced inches away. Corporal Hayes spoke then, voice barely above a whisper. "We owe them this." He gestured to the letters stacked at my feet. "They spoke when they could. We must carry their voices forward," I exhaled. A slow release of breath I hadn't realized I held. I said, letting the words settle in the damp air. "We will read them all. We'll bind them together and send them home. Every promise will be kept." Hands slid across wood to retrieve more letters. Photos of young faces, grinning beneath the brim of peaked caps, eyes bright or haunted, behind each a prayer or a confession or a plea. Every envelope carried the scent of distant laughter and near exile, spiced with cigars or gunpowder, softened by the honeyed perfume of home. We passed them quietly, each man lingering over one before passing it on, as though touching a sacred relic. In that moment, the trench became more than a line of defense. It became a sanctum for the unspoken. Each letter was a tether, binding us not only to the past but to hope itself. We read of midnight vigils under shaky lamps, of shared meals passed spoon to spoon, of dreams that dared to outshine the roar of artillery. A corporal begged his sweetheart to remember his laughter, not the tremor in his voice when the guns opened. A private confessed that he feared the moment he'd see his mother's face again, terrified that he would be too changed to recognize kindness in her eyes. As the final letter was broken and the last photograph examined, I looked around at the men who had gathered close, faces gaunt, uniforms caked with mud, eyes bright with unshed tears. The lamp threw long shadows on the walls, turning every letter into a monument rising from the earth. We were caretakers of this hidden archive, entrusted with the final words of the fallen. I pressed my palm to the beam under which we'd found the stash, as if sealing a pact with the wood. "They spoke from beyond," I murmured, voice thick with emotion. "They entrusted us with their last testament." The men nodded, solemn as clergy at a vigil. I unfolded a scrap of paper and held it aloft. "Tell my daughter I loved her." The plea shattered something inside me. I tucked it into my pocket, close to my heart, and straightened. "We march tomorrow at dawn," I said softly. "But tonight, we remember. Tomorrow, we carry them with us, in our hearts, in our voices, in every step we take." The trench responded in kind. A silence so deep it felt like prayer. I could almost hear the rustle of paper, the soft intake of breath, as though the letters themselves sighed in relief. The rain intensified, hammering the roof with renewed urgency. Yet inside, the dugout was serene, a sanctuary built from memory and ink. I closed my eyes and listened, not to the thunder outside, but to the quiet chorus of voices bound in paper. Each one whispered of love and loss, of promises deferred and dreams deferred, of lives suspended between hope and oblivion. And in that hush, I understood that our true mission was not merely survival, but remembrance. For as long as we carried these letters, we carried the souls of those who had fallen, and as long as we spoke their words aloud, they lived on. Voices beneath the rails, echoing through the trenches of history, demanding to be heard. Searing shells tore the night sky asunder, each blast a jagged tear in the stillness, and the trench shuddered beneath our feet. The world became rhythm and rupture, boom, bones rattling, boom, earth stained with fire. In the silence between explosions, the voices rose again, urgent and pleading, as if the shells themselves had awakened something buried deep within the mud. "Remember us," they breathed, "remember us." Private Morales stood at the trench's edge, rain plastering his hair to his scalp, eyes wide in the lantern light. His uniform clung to him, sodden and heavy, each droplet carrying the acrid tang of cordite and fear. He swallowed twice, lips cracked and trembling, seeking steadiness in the chaos. But steadiness fled as the voices circled him. Closer now, weaving through the gasp of breath and the chatter of shrapnel, a shell exploded in the distance. A bloom of orange flame against the trenched horizon. The concussion rocked Morales to his knees, hands pressed against his ears, but the voices did not relent. They grew louder, fractured syllables slicing through the roar. "Oh, forget us not, lend us your ears to set us free." Guilt blossomed in his chest, a dark flower fed by memory and regret. He rose unsteadily, head spinning, and turned to his comrades. Their faces were masks of grit and horror. Corporal Hayes's jaw clenched like knuckles on a bayonet. Sergeant Drake's eyes glistened with unshed sorrow. Andrews trembled, rifle drooping at his side. They had felt it too. The tremor in the earth that carried more than just artillery. They had heard the harvest of voices reaped from this slaughtered land. Morales gripped the trench's timber wall, waterlogged and splintered, and tried to anchor himself in something solid. But the letters beneath the rails, letters they had uncovered in Scene 4, felt like specters in his breast pocket, each fold heavy with a promise unfulfilled. He thought of his brother's last entrusting words, "Write me back, keep me alive in ink." He had failed. A whistle of incoming fire cut through the air. We ducked instinctively, the lantern sputtering as sparks danced in the gloom. Sandbags burst overhead, raining dirt and splintered wood. The world blurred in strobing light, men shouting, metal ringing, earth crumbling into powder. In that chaos, the voices broke free of the mud, clearer now, a chorus rising above the violence. Pleading, chanting, wailing, I crouched beside Morales, heart pounding. Every nerve in my body sang with adrenaline. But I felt a deeper tremor, the quake of shattered vows, of promises unread, of lives consigned to this bleeding earth. I placed a hand on his shoulder, cold through the soaked tunic. His head lolled, eyes unfocused, and he seemed half adrift between the living and the dead. "Speak," I urged, voice low as a prayer. He shook his head, rain sluicing into his eyes. His words caught on a sob. He glanced downward, and I saw him draw the folded letter from his pocket, fingers stained with mud. He unfolded it with trembling care. The letter bore his brother's scrawled script, ink smeared by rain and time. "Rafa, the nights are longer than hope. Write soon." His voice cracked in the darkness. I never sent it." The admission fell between us. A confession etched in shame. The voices surged, as though hungry for that guilt, wrapping around Morales like barbed wire. Then send it now, I said, heart in my throat. Speak for him. He bit his lip, eyes blank with terror. Above, the bombs fell in stuttered cadence. Thud, 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 rocking the trench like a cradle for the damned. He tried to steady his breath, inhaling the metallic tang of blood and diesel, the sweet rot of drowned timber. The voices pulsed in time, urging him, demanding. Morales lifted his head, shoulders trembling. Rafa, he whispered. The name hung in the cataclysm, fragile as a sparrow's wing. I'm sorry. The words twisted in his throat. He glanced at the men gathered. Hayes, Drake, Andrews, each witness to his confession. Tears glinted on his cheeks, mingling with the rain. In that moment, a lull washed over us. The guns fell silent, as though the trenches themselves held their breath. The only sound was the drip of water from shattered duckboards. The drip, 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 like a funeral toll. And then, unmistakable, the whisper returned. Forgive me, forgive me. Morales straightened, voice steadier now, carrying the weight of his brother's words. He spoke into the darkness, the letter held to his chest. Rafa, I hear you. I will carry your words home. The silence stretched, heavy with possibility. Somewhere beyond the trench, a lone crow cawed, an omen perhaps, but also a witness. Morales exhaled, shoulders slumping as if releasing a burden held too long. The voices receded, drifting back into the mud, leaving only that final whisper, "Thank you." Sergeant Drake stepped forward. Drake, placing a firm hand on Morales's back. "We'll get it home," he vowed, voice low and unyielding. "No more letters buried, no more voices lost." Morales nodded, closing his eyes. The lantern's flame steadied, chasing back the shadows. Around us, the trench felt less like a corpse's cradle and more like a threshold between guilt and redemption. Memory and release, life and the restless dead. The next shell slammed into the parapet, but we did not flinch. We had been broken open, exposed to the tremor of voices beneath the rails. Now we stood resolute, men no longer content to merely survive, but determined to carry the echoes of the fallen forward. Morales tucked the letter back into his pocket and drew a fresh sheet of paper from his pack. Hands still shaking, he scribbled feverishly by the lantern's glow, each stroke a bridge between worlds. We gathered round, reading over his shoulder. Words of confession and hope, promises to his brother, vows to every man whose voice had seeped from the mud. As he finished, he folded the letter with deliberate care, sealed it anew with a muddy thumbprint. In that simple act lay a restoration of faith, a testament that even here, under the relentless hail of war, compassion could outlast carnage. We pinned the new letter to the beam above our heads. Alongside the others uncovered, a row of promises hung in the dripping gloom. Letters to mothers, to sweethearts, to children unborn, each now destined for home. The rain pelted the trench, but inside, an ember of warmth glowed, a fragile flame of remembrance that no shell could extinguish in the hush that followed. I heard the faintest stir of voices, no longer desperate but at peace. We are heard, and in that acknowledgement, the trench seemed to breathe easier, as if the earth itself exhaled a sigh of gratitude. We retreated into the deeper darkness, boots sloshing in the water, hearts steadied by purpose. The whispers faded behind us, but their echo remained, a guiding current beneath the roar of battle, and I knew that no matter what lay ahead, we would carry these voices with us. Fissures of fear transformed into bonds of remembrance, linking the living and the dead in a silent vow to never forget. The memory arrived without warning, a silent tremor beneath my ribs that grew into a quake of recollection. One moment I stood in the soaked trench, heart still heavy from voices beneath the rails. The next, I was hurled backward through time to the eve of the charge. The night sky had been the color of spilled ink, pinpricked only by distant flares that bloomed like mournful stars. The air shimmered with heat from the incendiary rounds, and the front-line trench bristled with men bracing themselves for what was to come. At first, there was the lull, the deceptive calm before violence unfurled its final act. I ran a trembling hand over my rifle's barrel. its steel cool against my palm, and felt the pulse of the officer's whistle hovering in the dark. Around me, gas masks dangled loose at belts, fingers hovered above trigger guards, and every face was set in a mask of grim resolve. We had eaten little, slept less, and yet none complained. There was no room for complaint when every man carried the weight of his own fear and the lives of those beside him. I remember the odor most vividly, a rancid blend of sweat, cordite, and damp wool, laced with the sulphurous tang of death waiting in ambush. Inhaling felt like swallowing shards of glass, each breath a betrayal of the lungs. Yet I drew in deeply, steeling myself as the sergeant's voice cut through the dark. On my whistle, over the top. Then came the blow, a sharp, piercing note that seemed to split the night in two. With a single cry that rose from 100 throats, we surged upward, boots clambering onto the lip of the trench. The earth beneath us resonated, groaning as we spilled into no man's land. In that instant, time slowed and accelerated all at once. Bayonets gleamed in the flare light, the polished steel tipped with promise and death. My own blade felt weightless in my gloved fist as I plunged it forward, the world reduced to the ballet of survival. Mud spattered in slow arcs, trailing from the boots of comrades who stumbled beside me. A guttural roar filled my ears. The orchestra of war, rifles barking, shells screaming, men shouting and falling. I can still feel the sting of the gas as clouds drifted low, yellow and suffocating, hugging the shell-cratered earth. My throat burned, lungs seized in spasmodic coughs, and every step became a burning sacrifice. But I could not stop. If I faltered, I risked dragging my brothers into the mud with me. Ahead, silhouettes danced, some charging with feral abandon, others collapsing into the soft earth, hands clawing futilely at the sky. Amid the chaos, I glimpsed him. Private Collins, shirt torn and face smeared with grime. Eyes alight with both fear and defiance, he vaulted over a crater lip, rifle swinging, silhouette etched against the flare glow. I shouted his name, voice lost in the tempest of gunfire, yet he nodded. A single jerk of his head, and pressed on toward the barbed wire, we reached the tangle together. Twisted wire, cold to the touch, glinting with rusted promises of torment. Collins hacked at it with a trench knife, each cut sending sparks of steel into the air like fleeting stars. Then the wire gave way, and we plunged into the heart of the enemy's earth. The sight that met us was both grotesque and ordinary. Rows of shattered sandbags, splintered wood, and the hollow gazes of men no longer living. I recall the moment a shell detonated nearby, an orange blossom of destruction that scorched my cheek with shrapnel. Pain bloomed white-hot, and I crumpled to one knee, blood seeping through fingers pressed against torn flesh. The world tilted on its side. I could see the sky sideways, the flare lights arcing like kaleidoscopic tears. Collins was at my side in an instant, tugging my arm, his voice urgent though fractured by fear. We must push on, but I hesitated. The ground beneath me was slick with mud and blood, and I felt the ghostly presence of those who had fallen before, friends whose names I whispered to the earth. I thought of their letters smuggled home unread, of promises embroidered in ink and never fulfilled. Guilt washed through me like a colder tide than death itself. Guilt for living, guilt for leading, guilt for failing to save. I closed my eyes against the flare's sear, and heard again the voices from beyond the rails. Remember us. Set us free. The plea cracked like glass in my mind, and I realized then that this charge was not only against the enemy lines, but against oblivion itself. We fought not merely for ground, but for memory, for the voices that clamored in the dark, gathering every shred of resolve. I pushed to my feet. Pain flared with each movement, but it anchored me to the living world. With gritted teeth I pressed forward, bayonet low, hoping that every thrust might honor those who could not fight. Around me, men surged ahead, their silhouettes frantic, beautiful in their fearlessness. We reached the enemy parapet in a wave of steel and desperation. Hands grappled at sandbags, rifles barked into silence as foes toppled. The air was thick with smoke and cries, the ground quaking beneath the stampede of hope and horror. I remember wrenching a fallen soldier's rifle free, feeling his cold hand slip from the barrel as I aimed and fired at shapes I could not name. And then, sudden stillness. The firing ceased as quickly as it had begun. The flares died, swallowed by the returning night. We stood atop that shattered earth, panting, stained with the toil of survival. In the hush, I realized how many were gone. Bodies draped over craters, helmets upturned, rifles at rest. The cost lay at our feet like spent tokens of remembrance. I sank to the ground, exhausted, stomach heaving. My uniform was slick with mud and ichor. My hands trembled as I removed my helmet. Around me, men tended to the wounded, tended to the dead, as if sorting through the casualties of memory itself. Each one carried that same haunted expression, eyes too bright, mouths set in lines carved by terror. Collins appeared beside me, silent, his face streaked with soot and tears. He placed a hand on my shoulder, and I felt the tremor of shared guilt in his grip. No words passed between us. None were needed. We had faced the crucible together and emerged scarred but alive. I closed my eyes and listened to the night. The wind rustled across the torn earth, carrying with it a faint whisper. Voices from the deep trenches, voices that insisted on being heard. I pressed my palm to the ground, as if feeling the pulse of those who lay below. In that moment, I understood that the battle was never truly over. It would echo through every memory, every letter, every silent vow. Slowly, I rose. The world beckoned, trenches to hold, men to lead, stories to unearth, but within me burned the unwavering certainty that I would carry these memories forward. For in the final moments of that terrible advance, amid the rain of steel and flame, I had glimpsed the unbreakable bond between the living and the dead. And I knew that as long as I drew breath, I would honor the charge, not only on that field, but in every moment that followed, under cover of a moonless night. We crept beyond the battered parapet and into the skeletal remains of a trench long since collapsed. The air was cold, sharper than any winter wind, carrying the stale scent of decay and artillery lint. Our lanterns bobbed ahead like will-o'-the-wisps, casting narrow cones of light through the shredded timber and rusted iron brace. Lieutenant Hargrove motioned us forward, boots silent on the sodden ground, each man acutely aware of the fragile barrier between search and destruction. The earth was soft, waterlogged from days of rain, and with every step we sank deeper into the mud. Our breaths came slowly, each exhale a pale ghost in the lantern glow. Private Singh's torch fell, water seeping into its joints, and he cursed under his breath as he knelt to coax it back to life. I felt my heart pad against my ribs, hearing not only the tangible drip of water from the jagged trench beams, but something beneath it, a low, resonant hum that seemed to pulse through the earth itself. Hargrove signaled us to halt. Ahead lay a shattered wall of planking, half buried by clods of sod and shards of shell. He knelt, probing the mud with his bayonet, then exchanged a glance with Sergeant Drake. Together, they began to dig, first shallow strokes, then deeper, the blade slicing through earth that had lain undisturbed since the initial bombardment. Each scoop of mud revealed fragments of history, a splintered helmet rim, the buckle of a knapsack, a mangled tin of corned beef long emptied of its contents. We formed a line, hands raw and numb, and took turns with the bayonet and shovel. The silence grew dense, punctuated only by the squelch of wet soil and the occasional grunt of exertion. Somewhere above, a distant star blinked through a gap in the clouds, indifferent to our toil. The trench around us seemed to sigh, as though the earth itself recognized that we were unearthing secrets best left buried, after what felt like hours. Hargrove struck something hard, the clang of metal echoed softly, and he brushed away the final clumps of mud to reveal a tattered canteen. Its surface dented and corroded, water seeped from its seams, turning the grove of muck around it into a shallow pool. I stepped forward, breath catching in my throat, as Hargrove pried the canteen free. Its engraving was faint but legible. F.J. Aldridge. No one recognized the name. We exchanged puzzled looks, each man tracing the letters with a fingertip. The canteen's strap was frayed, the leather stiffened by age and moisture. A faint odor clung to its metal, a mixture of stale water and something fouler, the silent witness of countless days spent clutched in a dying hand. As Hargrove passed the canteen down our line, the earth trembled beneath us, a distant thud like the heartbeat of this ruined place. And then, in the hush that followed, we heard it. The voices, rising with sudden clarity, weaving through the trench like living streams. They sang in low, mournful harmony. F.J. Aldridge, remember me. Morales froze, hand midair as he accepted the canteen. His eyes widened, reflecting the small blaze of the lantern. I could see the color drain from his face as the voices swelled, pleading with such intensity that the wood around us seemed to vibrate in response. Remember me, they whispered again, and now each voice carried the weight of a lifetime, an echo of every letter wedged beneath the rails, every promise left unfulfilled. Hargrove's jaw clenched. He glanced back at us, silent command in his eyes. I felt my own pulse quicken, the lamp's flame dancing against the beam above. The voices grew louder, carrying suffused regret and an ache that wound through my chest like barbed wire. Do you hear them? I murmured to Morales. Though the words themselves felt unnecessary, he nodded, shoulders quivering. They won't rest, he breathed, not until we know who he was. Silence claimed us again, but only for a heartbeat. Then Sergeant Drake spoke, softer than I'd ever heard him. We owe him that much. He reached into his mud-stained tunic and produced a small notebook, its pages spotted with rain. Write it down, he said, voice firm amid the tremor. His name, what we've found, and where we'll lay him to rest. Under the flicker of lantern glow, Morales accepted the notebook. His fingers shook as he dipped a stub of pencil lead into his pocket for grip. Then, with deliberate care, he wrote, Found tattered canteen engraved F.J. Aldridge at collapsed trench section grid 29B, grave site unknown. Each word emerged slow and deliberate, as if sealing an unspoken pact. When he finished, he snapped the book shut, and the weights on all our hearts lifted just enough to let us breathe. The voices tapered off, drifting like wisps of smoke through the trench. In their absence, the clink of metal against mud sounded suddenly loud. Hargrove tapped the canteen's side thoughtfully. We'll carry it back, he declared. We'll find where he fell. His tone left no room for doubt. We nodded once, in unison, a silent vow to a man we'd never met. We resumed digging, now with purpose-fed urgency. The lamp's glow carved bright circles in the darkness as the blade struck wood again, this time part of a rusted plaque. Its lettering eroded but still present. We cleared more earth and uncovered a weathered metal plate, a regimental marker, half obscured, bearing the crest of the 5th Infantry. Below, a name, Frederick J. Aldridge, private. His service number, faint but decipherable, curled beneath the title. A collective breath exhaled. The simple act of discovery, resonating in each of us, the voices, the ones we sensed and the ones we heard, fell silent, as though content that he was acknowledged. We pressed our palms to the beam, and the mud, feeling the quiet echo of his life beneath our fingers. Hargrove extracted a small trowel from his pack, and we began again, this time with gentler strokes, unearthing the rest of his kit, a moth-eaten greatcoat, a flask with half-dried tea, a battered pocket watch forever stopped at 3:30. With each artifact revealed, we felt the distance between past and present narrow, as though Frederick Aldridge might step from the shadows. Grateful to be remembered, at last we reached a depression in the earth, a shallow hollow roughly the length of a man. The soil bore traces of human form, settled earth where a body had lain, pressed flat by time and weight. We paused, letting the lantern's yellow glow wash over the space. It was a grave. Silent and unmarked, waiting for recognition, Hargrove spoke first, voice reverent. He died here. He offered a salute, brow furrowed. Let's give him a proper resting place. We set to work with collective solemnity, lifting the sodden soil, carving a rectangular plot. The water pooled at the base, but we drained it with fragments of cloth until the hollow lay clear. Morales and Drake carefully arranged the canteen, the plaque, and the watch at the head of the grave, an altar of remembrance. The greatcoat was folded, placed beside the flask and the tin of tea. Then, in silence that felt sacred, We shoveled earth back into the hollow layer by layer, each man adding his share. The sound of mud against wood was soft, a dirge for the unnumbered dead. When the grave was filled, we tamped the earth with our boots, smoothing the surface with steady strokes. Above, the lantern's flame steadied, as though acknowledging the completion of our task. Hargrove produced a length of wire from his pack, and we fashioned a makeshift cross from a splintered beam. Both arms were carved with the name F.J. Aldridge and the inscription, "Believed killed in action." We drove the cross into the newly laid soil, its jagged edges catching the lantern's glow. Morales took a step back, head bowed. The voices had returned, soft, distant, but unmistakable. "Thank you, thank you." They were lighter now, like a breath released after a long plea. The earth around us seemed to settle, and the trench felt warmer, as if a burden had been lifted. We stood in a ragged line before the grave, each man offering a silent salute. No words were needed. The memory of Frederick Aldridge was etched into our souls. We shouldered our packs and turned back toward the living trench, the makeshift lantern retreating into the dark behind us. As we left, I looked back once more at the cross, the simple memorial standing against the mud and ruin. In the hush that followed, I could still hear the echo of a name spoken into the void, carried on the wind, Aldridge. And in that lingering whisper, I knew that the earth would no longer claim him unnoticed. We had answered the plea of the grave. And in doing so, we had honored the voices beneath the rails, voices that demanded remembrance, and at last received it. The storm gathered on the horizon like an unspoken warning, low clouds churning into bruised folds that blotted out the last sliver of daylight. I stood at the edge of the hollow grave beneath a shattered oak, hands thrust into the pockets of my greatcoat as the wind tugged at its collar. The earth beneath my boots was slick with rain, each footstep sinking deeper than the last, as if the ground itself sought to pull me down into its secret heart. All around me, the trench lay silent, its timbers bowed beneath the weight of years and neglect. Even the rats had quieted, as though sensing the solemn vigil about to unfold. Above, the first fat drops splattered against the canteen strapped to my belt, and I felt the cold bite of steel on my hip. The air tasted of ozone and damp wood, a breath of something raw and unguarded. I closed my eyes, letting the wind strip away the sweat and grime of the days past, until I felt raw and exposed beneath the darkened sky. In that moment, I was not a corporal or an officer. I was simply a man confronting the weight of all those who came before, voices that lingered long after the last gun fell silent. I knelt beside the freshly turned mound, pressing my palm into the soft soil. It gave under my touch, cool and yielding, as though offering itself in surrender, the makeshift cross we'd raised, 2 splintered planks bound with barbed wire, leaned against the oak's trunk, the name carved deep into its grain. F.J. Aldridge. I traced the letters with my finger, following each curve as if reading a sacred text. My breath came in shallow gusts, each exhale a confession carried away by the wind. Leaning back on my heels, I scanned the hollow's edge, the scattered artifacts we'd laid to rest with him, the corroded canteen, the rusted pocket watch. The frayed photograph slipped into the breast of his greatcoat, lay half swallowed by earth but still recognizably human. They were tokens of a life interrupted, reminders that here, in this mud-choked corner of the world, a man had lived and hoped and feared just as I did now. Just as I felt a tightening in my chest, a coil of guilt and reverence twisting deeper with every beat. Frederick Aldridge, I breathed, voice soft enough to crumble. We remember you. The words were fragile, whispers against the gathering storm, but they carried weight as though spoken into the very bones of the earth. For a moment, the wind stilled, as though the trench itself paused to listen. Even the rain held its breath, the hush between drops stretching taut as a wire. I rose to my feet, coat collar turned up against the chill, and walked a slow circle around the grave. Each step sank into mud so thick it reluctantly released the imprint of my boot. I felt time fracture, the line between past and present blurring into a single moment of communion. Overhead, the clouds parted just enough to let a stray shaft of light pierce the gloom, illuminating the cross in a pale glow. It seemed a benediction, a quiet absolution offered by the heavens themselves. I halted at the head of the grave, placing both hands on the cross's arms. The wood was rough beneath my gloves, splintering at the edges. I closed my eyes and spoke again, this time louder, the words rising with conviction. Your story will not end here. We carry you in our memories, in our letters, in every tale we tell. The wind answered me, rustling the oak's leaves in a mournful cadence, as though murmuring an assent. A distant roll of thunder grumbled like an echo of artillery, and the first steady pitter-patter of rain began anew. I didn't move. The drops tapped against the brim of my helmet, drummed along the rail of the trench, and pooled in the hollow of the grave. Each drop felt like a heartbeat, a pulse reconnecting me to something vast and inexorable. In that cold rain, I sensed the presence of all the men whose names were carved into the rails of history. The Aldridges and the Moraleses, the Thompsons and the Collinses, each offering their silent testimony. I reached into my tunic and withdrew the small leather-bound notebook, its pages damp but legible. Flipping to the last entry, I added a final line beneath Aldridge's name. Never forgotten, rest now and let us bear your burden. The pencil tip left a smudge of graphite that ran like tear trails across the paper. I closed the notebook and slipped it back into my pocket, the weight of it a promise to the earth and the dead. Turning away, I paused at the lip of the trench and looked back once more. The mound of earth glistened with rain, crowned by the cross that leaned like a sentinel against the dark. In that faint light, I thought I saw movement, a whisper of shadow at the edge of vision, a figure in uniform standing just beyond the oak's reach. I blinked, and it was gone, but the stillness that followed bore the stamp of presence, a soft sigh, as though the fallen exhaled in relief. I inhaled deeply, tasting the rain and earth and something more, something ancient and unnameable. The silence that lay over the trench felt profound, a hush that spoke louder than any gun. It was the sound of closure, of a debt paid at last, yet it was also a beginning, a threshold crossed between memory and peace. My boots sloshed as I climbed from the hollow, each step carrying me back to the living trench. Behind me, the oak's branches bowed to the storm, leaves trembling like raised hands in prayer. I pressed a gloved hand to my heart, feeling the rapid beat beneath. The rain streamed down my face, indistinguishable from the tears I refused to shed. In the hush that followed each thunderclap, I heard it again, faint but unmistakable. Thank you. I didn't turn back. I had said my part. The voices had been heard. They had been honored. Ahead, the trench stretched into darkness, its timbers receding into shadows that promised more secrets below. But I carried a light within me now, a fragile ember of remembrance and resolve as I strode toward my men. I knew this trench would no longer be a prison of silence, but a testament to those who spoke beyond the grave, and in that realization, I felt the storm break. The rain intensified, washing over me in a single cleansing flood. Yet instead of feeling battered, I felt renewed, for I had confronted the silent. And in doing so, I had given voice to the echoes of war in the hush of the trenches beneath the arc of a troubled sky. I walked on, bearing the burden of memory, carrying the charge of the fallen, and listening to the stillness that now spoke of peace. Dawn came softly, as though the world itself lingered in the hush before waking. The rain had washed the trench clean, stripping away the grime of yesterday's blood and sweat, leaving behind a pale wash of clay that gleamed in the early light. I stood at the foot of the dugout, breath misting in the chill before the sun broke fully, and felt for the first time in days the weight of quiet settle over us. The shells had fallen silent, and the wind, once a messenger of distant gunfire, had stilled, as if waiting for our next move. I ran a gloved hand along the wooden beams spanning the trench wall, fingers tracing the gouges of shrapnel and the carved initials of dead men. Every nick in the timber held a story. A laugh cut short, a fear confessed, a promise scrawled in trembling ink. The beam felt cold under my touch, yet through it I sensed warmth. an ember of shared memory that glowed despite the chill. The ground beneath my boots was firm, yet soft enough to absorb the echo of my footsteps, swallowing sound like a grave swallowing voices. Corporal Hayes emerged from the dugout, uniform still damp from last night's storm, eyes heavy with the residue of nightmares. He clasped his rifle to his chest as though it were a talisman, and I imagined the weight of every shell that had screamed overhead pressed into his bones. Behind him, the men followed in a ragged line, shoulders squared against the damp air, faces hollow but resolute. We had survived another night. Now we stood on the threshold of what might come. I reached into my breast pocket and withdrew a single dog tag, its steel surface dulled by mud and rain. On one side, my name was stamped J. Jameson. On the other, the number of a man I had fought to protect and sometimes protect from himself. I held the tag between thumb and forefinger, feeling the cold bite of metal and the promise it carried. Identity, memory, duty. With a deliberate motion, I pinned it to the beam alongside the others, dog tags of the fallen, each one swinging gently as the first breeze of dawn drifted through the trench. The tags chimed softly, a quiet chorus of metal on wood, and I closed my eyes to listen. In the collective tinkle, I heard more than iron. I heard names, Morales, Aldridge, Collins, echoing through the corridors of memory. I heard pleas half-whispered beneath the rails, and feeble laments carved in letters under last year's assault. I felt their presence here, unbound by earth or time, woven into the very fabric of this place. A shaft of pale gold lanced through the clouds, illuminating the trench in a glow that felt both sacred and uncertain. Dew clung to sandbags, each droplet refracting the light like tiny prisms, and the world held its breath. In that suspended moment, the sky above was riven with pastels, hints of rose and lavender bleeding into grey, mirroring the tension between hope and mourning etched on every face. I stooped and retrieved a folded sheet of paper from my pack, edges softened by moisture. It was my letter home, begun weeks ago when I still entertained the belief I would return unscathed. Now the words felt both inadequate and indispensable, my only tether to life beyond these mud-choked walls. I unfolded the page, breath steadying as I read the opening lines I had written in some earlier. Braver hour. My dearest Eleanor, the days grow long and the nights longer still, but I carry your voice in every heartbeat. I hesitated, vision blurring at the sight of my own handwriting. The ink had smudged, merging with the dampness as though the paper itself had absorbed my fears. I looked up at the beam, at the dog tags that danced in the new breeze, and found the resolve to continue. My pen scratched across the page, the words emerging slower now, each one weighed by memory and loss. There are moments when the world seems to tilt on its axis, when the cries of the past rise through the earth and beg to be heard. Last night I felt them beneath our feet, the voices of those who never made it home, calling out in the dark. I've learned their names, carried their letters, and laid their bodies to rest. In doing so, I have come to understand that survival is only half our burden. Remembrance is the other half. When tomorrow finds us, will we still listen to the echoes of those who died before? As I wrote the final question, the wind stirred again, stronger this time. Ruffling my hair and lifting the corners of my letter, I paused, pen poised in mid-air, and listened. For a heartbeat there was only silence, as though the trench itself hesitated to respond. Then, faint and unmistakable, I heard it. A soft, collective thank you carried on the breeze, so subtle I almost doubted my ears. I closed the letter and tucked it into my tunic, heart pounding with the weight of what I had asked. The men behind me stood in stillness, shadows given form by dawn's light. In their eyes, I saw the same question reflected. Would we continue to heed these murmurings, these ancient demands of memory, or would the din of tomorrow's orders drown them out? I looked toward the shattered lip of the trench, where the fields beyond beckoned, with the promise of open sky and free breath. An order might come at any moment. Push forward, hold the line, advance or retreat. But for now we had this dawn, this solemn interlude between what had been and what would be. I breathed deeply, tasting the damp earth and the faint sweetness of fallen blossom carried on the wind. I felt the dog tags warm against my back. A silent cadre of witnesses to my vows. I slid my hand along the beam, fingertips brushing the tags as if greeting old friends. The trench beneath us, once a graveyard of silence, now thrummed with quiet life. Echoes transformed from lament into legacy. I rose, shoulders straight, and turned to the men. "Prepare to move," I said softly, voice steady. "But let us carry their voices with us, not as burden, but as purpose." They nodded, rifles slung, eyes clear in the dawn. We squared our shoulders and climbed from the trench, boots leaving fresh imprints in the clay. Above, the sky brightened, the pastel hues yielding to steady gold. The wind whispered behind us one last time, a gentle benediction. We are remembered. As we stepped into the open, I held my breath, feeling the promise of sun on my face. The path ahead was uncertain, paved with fresh trials and unseen horrors. Yet beneath my feet lay the memory of those who had walked this ground before me, their voices woven into the very mud. And in each beat of my heart, I carried their echoes forward, vowing that tomorrow and every day after, we would still listen. Did this story move you? Then don't keep it to yourself. Like the video if you felt something. Subscribe for more powerful, true, inspired war stories. Share this with someone who still remembers. And in the comments, leave the name of someone you'd never forget. Your voice might echo where theirs once did.